The steaming cup of overpriced coffee sat untouched as Sarah watched the owner's face twist into a sneer. She had asked for water. Just water. And Marcus Hartwell acted like she had personally insulted his entire bloodline. What he didn't know was that her husband owned half the city, and in 30 minutes, everything would change. Sarah Chen stared at the glass of tap water the barista had reluctantly placed in front of her, the condensation already forming rings on the mahogany table. The irony wasn't lost on her that she sat in the most exclusive coffee shop in downtown Seattle, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, drinking free water while wearing a thrift store dress that had seen better days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Golden Bean wasn't just any coffee shop. It was the kind of place where tech executives held million-dollar meetings over artisanal lattes, where socialites gathered to discuss their charity galas, and where the average drink cost more than Sarah used to spend on groceries in a week. She had never intended to come here, but fate had a funny way of putting people exactly where they needed to be. 3 months ago, Sarah's life had been completely different. She had been Dr. Sarah Chen, a successful pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital, married to David Kim, a quiet software engineer who preferred books to parties and homemade dinners to fancy restaurants. They lived in a modest house in Queen Anne, drove practical cars, and saved their money for the things that mattered to them, like David's late-night coding projects and Sarah's medical conferences. But everything changed the day David walked into their kitchen and told her he had sold his small tech company. Not for thousands, not for hundreds of thousands, but for $2.8 billion. Sarah had laughed at first, thinking it was one of his rare attempts at humor. But when he showed her the contracts, when the lawyers started calling, when reporters began camping outside their house, she realized their quiet life was over forever. The adjustment had been harder than either of them expected. Suddenly, they were invited to galas they didn't want to attend, offered memberships to clubs they had no interest in joining, and hounded by financial advisors who wanted to manage money they weren't sure they wanted. David handled it with his usual quiet grace, donating massive amounts to children's charities and educational programs, but Sarah struggled with the attention and expectations that came with their new status. She had taken a leave of absence from the hospital, overwhelmed by the media attention that was affecting her patients and colleagues. For weeks, she barely left their house, reading medical journals and trying to figure out how to navigate a world where her every move was scrutinized. David was understanding, patient as always, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. That morning, David had left early for a meeting with his foundation's board of directors. They were launching a new initiative to provide coding education in underserved schools, and he was passionate about the project in a way that reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. Before he left, he had kissed her forehead and suggested she go out, maybe visit her favorite bookstore or take a walk in the park, anything to get her out of the house. Sarah had intended to do exactly that. But as she walked through downtown Seattle, she found herself drawn to the energy of the business district. She missed working, missed feeling useful, missed the routine of her old life. When she saw the Golden Bean, with its warm lighting and the soft murmur of conversation drifting through its windows, she decided to stop for a coffee and maybe read for a while. She should have known better. She should have remembered that places like this weren't designed for people who looked like her, dressed like her, or carried themselves with the understated confidence of someone who had earned their success rather than been born into it. But Sarah always believed that kindness and respect were basic human courtesies regardless of someone's appearance or perceived social status. The trouble started the moment she walked through the door. The hostess, a perfectly polished woman in her 20s with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, looked Sarah up and down with barely concealed disdain. Sarah's jeans were clean but worn, her sweater was comfortable but not designer, and her purse was practical rather than fashionable. In a place where status was measured by the logos on your clothing and the car you drove, Sarah looked like she had wandered in from a completely different world. "Table for one?" the hostess asked, and she added, "I hope the answer would be no." Sarah nodded, following the woman to a small table in the back corner, far from the windows and the better seating. She didn't mind, really.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had brought a book and was looking forward to some quiet time away from the empty house that still didn't feel like home, despite the security system and the staff David had insisted they hire. The menu was exactly what she expected, full of drinks with names like the Executive Blend and Power Lunch Latte, each priced high enough to make her former self wince. Sarah had grown up in a family where money was tight, where every purchase was carefully considered, and old habits died hard. Even with billions in the bank, she couldn't bring herself to spend $15 on a cup of coffee. When the waitress came to take her order, Sarah smiled and asked for water, just water. She wasn't particularly thirsty, but she wanted to sit and read, and ordering something seemed like the polite thing to do. What she hadn't expected was the reaction her simple request would generate. The waitress, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a designer uniform, stared at her like she had just asked for something obscene. "Just water?" she repeated, loud enough that several nearby tables turned to look. "Yes, please," Sarah said, her cheeks beginning to warm with embarrassment. The waitress sighed dramatically and walked away, but not before Sarah heard her mutter something to another employee about people who can't afford to be here. The comment stung more than it should have, not because of the money, but because of the assumption behind it, the casual cruelty of judging someone based on their appearance. That should have been the end of it. Sarah should have received her water, read her book, and left. But Marcus Hartwell had other plans. Marcus owned the Golden Bean, and he ruled it like a small kingdom where he was the undisputed monarch. He was a man in his 50s who had inherited money from his family's restaurant empire and used it to create a chain of upscale coffee shops that catered to Seattle's elite. He was known for his expensive suits, his collection of vintage watches, and his talent for making anyone he deemed unworthy feel unwelcome in his establishments. Sarah was deep in her book when his shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find a tall, thin man with graying hair and cold blue eyes staring down at her with undisguised irritation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Marcus Hartwell, the owner of this establishment." Sarah closed her book and looked up at him politely. "Hello," she said, unsure why the owner would be introducing himself to her. "I understand you ordered water," Marcus said, making the word sound like a profanity. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied, confused by his tone. Marcus glanced around the dining room, ensuring he had an audience, then looked back down at Sarah with an expression of theatrical disgust. "This is the Golden Bean, not a homeless shelter. We serve premium beverages to discerning customers who can afford to appreciate quality. Individuals who clearly can't afford our offerings." Sarah's hands began to shake, not with fear, but with an anger she rarely allowed herself to feel. She had spent years in medical school being underestimated because of her age and gender. She had worked double shifts to prove herself worthy of her position at the hospital. She had saved children's lives, comforted grieving families, and dedicated her career to helping others. And this man was treating her like garbage because she had ordered water. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice still controlled, but with an edge that made Marcus pause. "The only misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice rising, is you thinking you belong in a place like this. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're making my other customers uncomfortable." Sarah looked around the restaurant and saw that he was right about one thing. People were staring. Some looked uncomfortable, but not because of her presence. They were uncomfortable because they were witnessing something ugly, something that revealed the kind of person Marcus Hartwell really was beneath his expensive clothes and polite veneer. A woman at a nearby table was shaking her head in disgust. A young man in a business suit was reaching for his phone, possibly to record what was happening. An elderly couple by the window looked appalled by Marcus's behavior. But Marcus seemed oblivious to their reactions, too caught up in his performance of superiority to notice that his audience wasn't impressed. "I'm not making anyone uncomfortable," Sarah said, standing up slowly. She was several inches shorter than Marcus, but there was something in her posture that made him take a step back. "But you're embarrassing yourself and your business." Marcus's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am? Do you know what I'm worth? I could buy and sell people like you 100 times over." "People like me?" Sarah repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Yes," Marcus said, emboldened by what he mistook for submission. "People who can't afford to be here, who don't understand their place in the world. Look at yourself." He gestured at her outfit with obvious contempt. "Your clothes are from a thrift store. Your purse is falling apart. You ordered water because you can't afford coffee. You don't belong here." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the employees had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, could sense phones being discreetly pulled out to record the scene. In a few hours, this would probably be all over social media, another viral video of someone being humiliated for not meeting arbitrary standards of wealth and status. But Sarah wasn't the same woman who had walked into this coffee shop an hour ago. Something had changed in the space between Marcus's first sneer and his final insult. She had spent months hiding from her new reality, feeling guilty about money she hadn't asked for and opportunities she hadn't sought. She had let herself feel small and uncertain, questioning whether she deserved the life that had been thrust upon her. Looking at Marcus Hartwell, watching him perform his cruelty for an audience that was clearly disgusted by his behavior, Sarah realized something important. Money didn't make someone worthy of respect. Success didn't give anyone the right to treat others as less than human. And she didn't have to accept being treated this way by anyone, regardless of how many coffee shops they owned or how expensive their watch was. "You're right," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "I don't belong here." Marcus smiled triumphantly, clearly thinking he had won. "I don't belong in a place that treats people this way," Sarah continued. "A place where the owner thinks cruelty is a form of entertainment. A place where human decency is considered optional." Marcus's smile faltered. "I think you should leave now," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I am leaving," Sarah said, picking up her purse and her book, "but not because you told me to. I'm leaving because I choose to. Because I deserve better than this, and so does everyone else who has to witness your behavior." She walked toward the door, every eye in the restaurant following her progress. As she reached for the handle, she heard Marcus call out behind her, "And don't come back. This is a respectable establishment for respectable people." Sarah paused at the door and turned back to look at him one more time. "Respectability isn't about money, Mr. Hartwell. It's about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. And by that measure, you're the poorest person in this room." She pushed through the door and out onto the sidewalk, her heart pounding with adrenaline and anger. The autumn air was crisp against her flushed cheeks, and she took several deep breaths to calm herself. She had handled the situation with as much dignity as she could manage, but the humiliation still burned. Sarah pulled out her phone to call David, then hesitated. He was in his meeting, passionate about his work in a way that made her happy to see. She didn't want to interrupt him with her problems, especially not problems that seemed so petty compared to the important work he was doing.
Instead, she sent him a text message asking if they could meet for lunch when his meeting was over. She suggested a small cafe they had discovered during their early dating years, a place where the owner knew their names and the coffee was good without being pretentious, a place where people were treated with kindness regardless of what they wore or how much money they had. As she walked away from the Golden Bean, Sarah didn't notice the black sedan that had been parked across the street or the security detail that had been discreetly watching the coffee shop since she had entered. She didn't know that David's assistant had been tracking her location at David's request, not because he didn't trust her, but because the death threats had started coming in shortly after news of the sale broke, and he worried about her safety every moment they were apart. Most importantly, she didn't know that David had finished his meeting early and was already on his way to meet her, having received not only her text message, but also a phone call from his head of security describing what had just transpired at the Golden Bean. Sarah walked slowly through the streets of downtown Seattle, processing what had happened and trying to understand why it had affected her so deeply. She had faced worse discrimination in medical school and during her residency. She had dealt with patients' families who questioned her competence because of her age or her ethnicity. She had navigated a professional world that often treated women as second-class citizens. But this felt different somehow, more personal. Marcus Hartwell had looked at her and seen someone he could humiliate without consequences. Someone whose feelings didn't matter because she didn't matter.
In his world, worth was measured solely by wealth, and anyone who didn't meet his standards deserved whatever treatment they received. What bothered Sarah most wasn't the humiliation itself, but the realization of how many other people had probably been treated the same way. How many students saving money for textbooks had been made to feel unwelcome. How many elderly people on fixed incomes had been subjected to Marcus's contempt? How many hard-working people had been judged and found wanting simply because they couldn't afford to spend $15 on coffee? By the time Sarah reached the small cafe where she was meeting David, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to feel guilty about money that could be used to make the world a little bit better. And she definitely wasn't going to let Marcus Hartwell continue treating people like disposable objects for his entertainment. She ordered a simple coffee and a sandwich, smiling at the young server who treated her with casual friendliness. This was how interactions should go, she thought, with basic human respect and kindness. It shouldn't matter what someone wore or how much they spent. Everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. David arrived 20 minutes later, and Sarah could tell immediately that something was different. His usually calm demeanor was slightly strained, and his eyes held a hardness she rarely saw. He kissed her hello and sat down across from her, his movements more controlled than usual. "How was your meeting?" Sarah asked, though she sensed his mind was elsewhere. "Productive," David said, then paused. "How was your morning? I got your text about lunch." Sarah hesitated, then decided to tell him everything. She described her decision to visit the Golden Bean, Marcus's behavior, and her own response to the situation. As she spoke, she watched David's expression grow progressively darker, though he listened without interrupting. When she finished, David was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said, his voice gentle, but with an undertone that made Sarah look at him more carefully. "It's okay," she said. "I handled it. I'm more angry than hurt, really." "It's not okay," David said firmly. "It's never okay for someone to treat you that way or to treat anyone that way." He paused, then added, "I got a call from security about what happened. They were concerned about the crowd that gathered and the potential for the situation to escalate." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Security? I didn't see any security."
David squeezed her hand. "They're discreet. But Sarah, after what you've told me and what they witnessed, I think it's time for Marcus Hartwell to learn about consequences." There was something in David's tone that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She had seen her husband angry before, but this was different. This was the controlled fury of someone with the resources to do something about injustice and the determination to use them.
"What are you thinking?" she asked, though part of her already knew. David pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "James, it's David. I need you to research the ownership structure of the Golden Bean coffee chain." "Yes, immediately. I want to know everything about their finances, their leases, their suppliers, everything. And James, clear my schedule for the rest of the day." He hung up and looked at Sarah with the same expression he wore when he was solving a particularly complex coding problem. Marcus Hartwell thinks wealth gives him the right to humiliate people. Let's show him what real wealth can do when it's used purposefully. David's phone calls began immediately. The first was to Meridian Properties, acquiring every lease that kept the Golden Bean operational. The second secured the coffee supply chain. The third bought the cleaning contracts. Within 30 minutes, Marcus Hartwell's empire belonged to someone else. "It's done," David told Sarah as they drove back to the coffee shop. He wanted to know about real power. Let's show him. Marcus was still entertaining his business associates when they walked in. He didn't notice them at first, too busy boasting about his success to pay attention to new customers. David ordered coffee and waited patiently for Marcus's phone to start ringing. The first call came within minutes. Sarah watched Marcus's confident expression crumble as someone delivered news that clearly devastated him. His voice grew louder, more desperate as he argued with whoever was on the other end. The second call followed immediately, then a third. Each conversation left him more panicked than the last. Finally, Marcus noticed David and Sarah at their corner table. Recognition dawned slowly, his face going pale as he connected the billionaire tech mogul with the woman he had humiliated that morning. He approached their table with unsteady steps. "Mr. Kim," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide his panic. "What brings you here?" David looked up from his coffee with mild interest. "Hello, Marcus. We need to talk about your business situation." "I don't understand." "Of course you don't," David replied pleasantly. "Let me explain. As of 20 minutes ago, I own your lease agreements, your coffee supply chain, and your cleaning contracts. I believe that makes us partners now." Marcus's hands shook as he processed this information.
"That's impossible." "Is it? Perhaps you should verify that with your various vendors." David's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "You see, Marcus, this morning you taught my wife about knowing one's place in the world. I found your lesson fascinating." The restaurant had gone quiet, customers sensing the drama unfolding. Marcus fumbled with his phone, making frantic calls to confirm what David was telling him. Each conversation confirmed his worst fears. "What do you want?" Marcus whispered. David smiled, and the expression contained no warmth. "I want you to understand something about real power. It's not about humiliating people you think can't fight back. Real power is changing someone's entire world with a few strategic decisions." He stood slowly, his presence somehow commanding despite his quiet demeanor. "My wife came here for coffee, and you decided she was beneath your notice. You made assumptions about her worth based on her clothes and treated her like garbage for your own entertainment." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but David continued. "You were wrong about everything, Marcus. Dr. Sarah Chen has saved more lives than you've served customers. She's earned her success through skill and compassion. She's worth more than you'll ever understand." The entire coffee shop was listening now, customers recording the confrontation on their phones. Marcus's reputation was disintegrating in real time. "Here's what's going to happen," David said. "You're going to apologize to my wife. Then you're going to apologize to everyone who witnessed your behavior this morning. After that, we'll discuss the future of your business."
Marcus looked around the restaurant, seeing his audience with new eyes. These weren't admirers anymore. They were witnesses to his downfall. "I apologize," he said to Sarah, his voice hoarse. "I was completely wrong to treat you that way." Sarah accepted the apology with grace, more dignity than Marcus had shown anyone. Around them, customers murmured approval. David sat back down, his demeanor returning to his usual calm. "Good. Now, Marcus, you have a choice. You can continue running these locations under new management guidelines that prioritize respect for all customers. Or you can sell me your interest and find a new career." "What kind of guidelines?" Marcus asked, knowing he had no leverage left. "Simple ones. Every customer gets treated with courtesy regardless of their appearance or order. Staff gets trained on hospitality, not intimidation. And prices get adjusted so more people can afford good coffee in a welcoming environment." Marcus looked around his restaurant, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. The intimidating atmosphere he had cultivated suddenly felt hollow and cruel. His empire, built on making others feel inferior, was crumbling because he had targeted the wrong person. "I'll accept your guidelines," he said quietly. David nodded. "Excellent. My team will contact you tomorrow with specific changes. You'll find that inclusion is actually more profitable than exclusion." As they prepared to leave, David paused at the hostess station. The young woman who had initially seated Sarah looked terrified, expecting to be fired. But David's expression was kind. "Going forward, I want you to remember that every person who walks through this door deserves respect and kindness," he told her gently. "Can you do that?" She nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." David handed her his card. "If you're ever pressured to treat customers poorly, call me directly." Walking to their car, Sarah felt a profound sense of justice. The morning's humiliation had been transformed into something powerful, a demonstration that respect wasn't a luxury, but a basic right. "How do you feel?" David asked. Sarah considered carefully. "I feel like you showed Marcus something he needed to see, that real strength comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down." David smiled, warmth returning to his eyes. "That's exactly what I hoped." 6 months later, the Golden Bean had become Seattle's most beloved coffee chain, known for welcoming everyone with warmth and respect. Marcus had discovered that treating people with dignity was not only right, but remarkably good for business. The story spread throughout the city, becoming a legend about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance. Sarah returned to her hospital work, advocating for overlooked patients. David continued supporting businesses that shared their values of inclusion and human dignity. Because real power, they had learned, wasn't about what you could destroy, but about what you could build and who you could lift up along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.